In this video, I'm covering round 1 of the 2022 Sinquefield Cup. Now all of the games were drawn in this first round except for one, so I'm going to start by showing you some interesting positions from the drawn games, followed by an in-depth analysis of the one decisive game, which was Carlsen versus Nepo. Alright, let's get started. In the Firouzja versus Caruana game, we got this position here, it's white to move. What would you play? Firouzja had the opportunity to play bishop takes e6 check, rook takes, and then have a good knight versus a bishop endgame here. Not sure why he didn't do that. He decided to completely equalize with knight takes f6 check, takes, now the bishop takes, and this is just a total draw. The rooks come off the board, and that's all she wrote. Dead drawn position. In the game Nieman or Nieman versus Aronian, I'm not sure which one it is, white threw away any winning chances he had in this position when he played queen to h4. What he should have played was knight to a4, looking to go to c5. This is very nice for white. He might have some winning chances, but after queen to h4, g5 is played. And now this queen is severely short on squares. She has to go to h6, but now queen f7 defends f6, and knight to f5 is a threat. So if you try to make your little knight maneuver now, knight to f5, queen goes here, it's the only square, knight takes d4, bishop's hitting the queen. So instead of trying to do that knight maneuver, white had to block the diagonal from the bishop to avoid that. Now black gets some counterplay with f5. Gives up the g5 pawn, but it doesn't really lose a pawn because f takes g4, this pawn's pinned. You can't recapture, and this is looking pretty scary. So white throws in a check, blocks with the knight, and then bishop e2, you got to defend f3. King to f8, adding some more defense to that knight there. This queen's free to move. Queen goes here, and we just end up getting a draw by repetition with knight d6 and then the check. White did not want to allow black to continue the attack, so I guess that's the way the players wanted to end it. The computer says the position's dead drawn at this point. In Dominguez versus MVL, MVL with the black pieces has this position and plays knight to d5. Better would have been king to a7 defending this pawn, but this gives white good winning chances after bishop takes, knight takes. Now white can grab this pawn here on a6. And this bishop's in a pretty aggressive location. Black puts the rook to the open file out of danger from the bishop there. And now white should play like rook e1, targeting this pawn, and then you got moves like after knight f5, we can start pushing this pawn, and the king's in kind of an insecure situation there. But instead, Dominguez moves his bishop to c4. This is a bad square for the bishop because it's just going to let black double his rooks with tempo with this move here. It's going to come with an attack on the bishop. I guess maybe he thought the knight was coming to d5, I don't know. But knight f5 is played, and here, instead of a move like rook e1, that would have been the best choice, even though it does allow this here, and then something has to be done with the bishop, and then the rooks can double. Black has good compensation for this slightly weakened king side, but instead, Dominguez decides to take this pawn and sack the exchange for the pawn, knight d4. And, okay, so he gets another pawn, knight takes, pawn takes, and this is just a drawn position. It ended in a draw in another 40 moves or so. And now for our feature presentation, Carlsen versus Nepo. So Magnus begins with d4, and we end up with this typical exchange variation, knight c3, c6. Until this point, Magnus plays bishop f4, which is a little bit unusual. Bishop g5 is much more common. That way you're kind of discouraging black from playing bishop f5, getting that bishop to a nice diagonal because you got queen b3, attacking b7, and black's ideal defense, queen b6, can be met with bishop takes f6, and you're messing up black's pawns over here. So you're kind of discouraging bishop f5 with the bishop g5 move for that reason, but bishop f4 does not attack this knight, therefore bishop f5 is what can be played here, and black has a pretty comfortable game. So e3, knight b d7, and bishop e7, some normal developing moves. Then Carlsen goes for this g4 move. We got bishop e4, and now you can take, but Carlsen didn't do this because after knight takes, this isn't anything to get too excited about. This knight's on a pretty good square. So instead, he just develops bishop e2. Now we got queen b6, queen b3. Carlsen allows this queen takes b3, giving him bad pawns, but the rook has an open file, and perhaps this pawn can march up and trade itself off at some point. Bishop g6 here. Now maybe black doesn't want Carlsen to take like that, and the queens are off the board, so maybe the knight here isn't so exciting anymore. Knight h4 hits the bishop, but more importantly, it's looking at this f5 square, because black can win a pawn with bishop c2 for the moment. King d2, bishop takes b3, but white gets some counterplay with knight to f5, hitting the bishop, hitting g7, so maybe the bishop defends. And then we get rook a3, and this bishop's kind of short on squares. You go to c4, we got takes, takes, knight d6 check, bishop takes, this variation. And this pawn is in kind of an awkward place. How do you really defend it? Anytime you play b5, the rooks can double up on the a pawn. So that pawn's probably going to drop off at some point. So Ian knew that winning that pawn was nothing to get too excited about. He just played bishop b4 instead, pinning this knight, maybe looking to drop in here with this knight. Carlsen takes out the bishop on g6, and then plays f3 to keep that knight from coming to that square. Now knight to f8's played, looking to redeploy to e6. King to f2, connecting the rooks, unpinning this knight. Knight to e6 is played, the bishop drops back. King to e7, black connects his rooks. Now we got h4 by Magnus, because he probably doesn't want g5 to get played at some point, and then this pawn is hard to advance. It's kind of a target on h3, a backward pawn there. So h4 played, and now a6, looking to move this rook towards the center, and this pawn is now not in danger of being captured by that rook there. But Carlsen criticized this move after the game. He said that a5, he thought that was a little better. The pawn's defended by the bishop, and maybe the bishop can just hang out there. How's this pawn going to advance and trade itself off? But after a6, we got king g2 from Carlsen. He wants to be able to drop this bishop back, because he's anticipating that black is going to be able to play bishop d6 and offer the bishop trade. So black moves the rook to the middle, and then we get bishop to f2, anticipating this bishop d6 move, because the bishop wasn't doing a whole lot there anymore. That knight's not pinned. Now we got bishop d3. This is just kind of a waiting move, moving the bishop to a more active diagonal. See what black's going to do next. Bishop b8 is played, and this is a mistake. Carlsen said that he was happy to see this, because now he's going to be able to get in his b4 move. So he plays knight to a4. He's getting ready to put the bishop here, and that's going to support the b4 advance. So black puts his bishop back to d6. That stops b4 for a moment. If you try to stop it with a5, well, then we just get bishop e1, and this pawn's hit. You got to do something to protect it, and then we're just going to play b4 anyway. So bishop d6, and now bishop to e1. The point of that was this knight was gone. It wasn't hitting that pawn anymore. So now the bishop doesn't need to be out of the way of that rook. c5 is still a possibility for black. That was his plan here. And here he does play c5, which is a big mistake, opening up things with that move. Better was king d7, and then let white get his b4 move in, and then tuck the king back here, and knight c5. This is kind of a strategic victory for white. He's got his knight here on a beautiful square, and you can't really kick that knight. If you go b6, this pawn's going to fall. There's too many pieces hitting it. And if you ever take out that knight, well, this is good for white, because now he doesn't have the double pawns. The bishop's got to move here, and he's got the two bishops, and white just has a strategically won game here. You got ideas of h5 here, and then if the pawn takes, we go g5, driving that knight back, and then we take with the rook. The rooks are going to double on this file here. Yeah, white is definitely winning, but c5 is worse. c5 allows knight takes c5, which actually is not the best move. Carlsen criticized his own move after the game, because this would have allowed bishop takes c5, d takes c5, followed by d4. Now Ian either didn't see this or he didn't think it was good, but the point of this is you can't take on d4, or else knight to f4 check wins that bishop. So you have to do something else. Let's say bishop c4, and now black can take on e3. White is still better here with the active bishops, but black might have some chances here. This gives black his best hope. Carlsen said that instead of taking with the knight, he should have taken with the pawn. That way this bishop is under attack, and he's got to, there's not going to be any d4 supported by a knight here. So that was a missed opportunity by Ian, but knight takes c5, takes, now bishop takes. Now bishop d2, protecting this pawn. And now we get rook h to e8, b4. There wasn't any good way to stop this move, so Carlsen has sort of a strategic victory here, getting that move in. Once the bishop moves, he immediately goes to b5, and black is running into problems now. He pretty much has to give up a pawn with a5. This pawn is under attack, so giving up the pawn with a5 is the best choice here. If you try to take on b5, you know, this is giving the bishops too much activity and black's going to run into big trouble. So this comes with tempo on the rook. The rook moves, we get bishop b4 check. The king has to go towards the middle now. Now we go rook a to e1. We're looking to play e4, so like if black just made some passing move, e4 is a big problem. If you take, there's this, check, king moves. Now we start eating up these pawns over here. And what else can black try to do? If you try d4 here instead, well, again, we get bishop c4 check, king moves, we grab this pawn. You know, this is all falling apart for black. Maybe the best try here would be rook to c8. That way, there's no bishop c4. But now we go bishop d3, and we have another plan. This guards c2, by the way, so the rook doesn't come into here. So now, let's say bishop c5. Black would like to get rid of a pair of bishops because those bishops are so dangerous, especially with the king where it is. So we don't allow that. We go to d2. And now let's say you put a rook right here. If you leave the rook on c8, there's a problem here. There's this tactic. What would you play here as white? Okay, the move is h5. White is doing a similar thing that he did over here on the other side of the board. So this pawn is under attack. There's not really any good way to defend, but if you take bishop f5 check, we get the rook. So let's say back here you try to play something like rook a8, get the rook off of that c8 square. Well, now we'll just play g5, kick the knight, and play e4. If he takes, we got rook takes e4 check. And you can see where the black king is just in a big predicament. He's going to start losing material. I mean, yeah. You can just tell with the two bishops, and yeah, it's over. So, Ian makes the wise decision to give up the pawn with a5. This is the best hope. Bishop takes, takes, rook takes, king to d6. Okay, so now e3 is hit. Magnus plays king f2 defending, and now black makes a mistake with rook to e7. Rook to a8 is best, looking to eliminate a pair of rooks. White's best response here would be b4. That way if black takes, he's going to heal his pawn structure. So let's say knight d7 is played. This is the best move for black, looking to go over here and defend this weak d pawn. Rook d1, knight b6, e4, attacking the pawn. The rook goes here, and then rook a7 can be met with rook c7, defending that b7 pawn. Bishop b1 looking to go to a2, target that pawn further, but now king to e5, and the pawn is not pinned anymore. So this is the best chance for black. But after rook to e7, we got rook d1. Now black decides to try to get some counterplay with rook to h8. If you tried this, going after this pawn here, this is interesting. b6 can be played. And if the rook takes, now we got bishop c4. That pawn's pinned. It's hit by 3 pieces. Rook to e5 defending, but now g5, kicking the knight, and now there's a big trade on this d5 square. Takes, king's in check, so we go here. Now, what would you play here as white? The most decisive move here is bishop to b5 check. King takes, and we get the rook, and we're hitting this pawn. If the king defends, now what would you play as white? Most decisive move here is bishop c6. Going after that pawn, it can't be defended, and if the pawn takes the bishop, well, we're getting a queen. So that's an interesting variation. Not what happened, though. What happened was rook to h8, and Carlsen plays g5. The knight moves, and then this pawn's under attack. Magnus decides to defend with rook to a4. Even better would have been b6, allowing rook takes h4, but now we go like this. You know, this rook is now looking at this pawn. Knight takes b6 is possible, but here the knight is going to be in trouble here. The knight's hit, and anytime that knight moves, we're just going to take that pawn with check, so that's going to be very nice. And if you try to just keep the knight there with some protection on the pawn, well, rook c1 check, you can see that the knight's going to end up getting lost after this kind of a thing. You can throw in the check with the rook, it doesn't help. That knight's pinned, it's going to be lost if you try to do this. Well, you can't even do that because this rook was hit, so Yeah. But Carlsen played rook a4 and just defended this pawn, just eliminating any counterplay for black along this file. It's probably a good practical decision, although not objectively best. Now here, black plays knight to c5. Carlsen said he thought this move was a mistake, and he was correct. Knight b6 was a little better defense. Now rook d4, at least this pawn has a little extra protection. The king can get out of the pin. And now we go to g3. We're defending this pawn so that e4 can be played, which blocked the rook's defense of that pawn. And so, let's say rook c7, e4, move a rook to the center. White doesn't have any spectacular finish right away, but can play f4 and this kind of stuff, looking to put the bishop here, so we don't want to allow that. And then we can play f5, and we're going to get the pawn majority over here. The rooks are very active. This pawn's still weak. We got the bishop. White has a one game here. But it's a little more of a difficult task for white in that case. Knight c5 makes things pretty easy for white. Rook g4 is what's played. If you try to go to like a central square like this, then knight e6 is just going to kick the rook around. So Carlsen goes to g4. And then we got king to c7. Now here's an interesting variation. If you take the bishop and you go down this road, looking to defend the pawn with the rooks, we can trade everything off here, and this is a lost endgame for black. I don't know if this was all calculated by Ian, but after all of this, you can even let black get a queen, because we're going to queen on the next move, and black does not have a check, and we still got the two extra pawns. So just a little side variation there. So no knight takes d3 check here, instead king to c7, and now Carlsen plays bishop to b1. d5 is under attack. Bishop a2 is coming in a minute. The rook defends. If you try to defend like this, we're just going to double the rooks, and the rook can go here, bishop a2. But the rook defends with rook e5. Now we got bishop a2. Now f6. Trying to get some kind of counterplay over here, I guess, but just pawn takes, takes. Rook takes here, takes. Bishop takes. Knight goes here with check. King moves. And you probably shouldn't take that pawn with the knight, because then the rook takes this pawn, and you really need to just go here and defend that pawn instead. The rook goes here attacking this pawn. The rook goes here counterattacking the bishop. And here, what would you play as white? Magnus played b6 check, and then Ian resigned, because if the king takes, well, then we get the pawn with check. So black doesn't have time to capture the bishop. And what other options are there? You move the king here, we get bishop e6 check. And then when the king moves, we take that pawn. The bishop's no longer in danger. And then if like king to d7, well, that blocks the rook's view of the bishop. So white's just going to have too many pawns. And Ian saw all that, I'm sure, and decided to throw in the towel.